So this is the argument that I discuss a little bit in the text. Um, what we'll do is we'll look at the original source just to get a sense for how we'll begin determining where the conclusion is and what the premises are, and to help us look for some of the inferences. And then we'll analyze the argument in a little bit more detail as we go on. So, as we said, Epicurus was an ancient philosopher who argued, among many other things, that we shouldn't be afraid to die, so that the fear of death wasn't supported by any good reason. So he makes this argument most famously in a letter to his friend Monesius. And so the relevant passage runs as follows. He's saying, look, accustom yourself, Monesius, to believing that death is nothing to us. For good and evil imply the capacity for sensation, and death is the privation of all sentience, etc., etc., etc. So when we're reading something like this, of course, the language is a little bit antique. Maybe there's an awful lot of words here. This is tough thing to do, to dive into a text like this and to try to figure out, okay, well, what's the point? And so what's the point means what's the main contention, what's the conclusion, what's Epicurus trying to say to us here, and what are his assumptions, and how does he argue for this position. So he's saying to us, or he's saying at least to Monesius, accustom yourself to believing that death is nothing. Now, what we'll see that as we read through, we'll see that he sort of repeats the main contention. This will often happen later on, as we'll see on the slide. He says, foolish is the person who says that they fear death. So we have the conclusion that he's trying to defend is that, don't worry about dying. That's the main point. Now that's pretty clear here. So at your leisure, at your convenience, you can pause the slide and read the actual passage yourself. What we're going to find is that we'll look for words like, on the slide here, therefore. So here we're looking at the therefore and because words. Therefore often indicates a conclusion. So if someone says, they give a string of reasons and then says therefore ... then you should be on the lookout for a conclusion. It's not always the case. Sometimes it's a sub-conclusion, etc. But the therefore is what we're looking for. The because words here indicate reasons for believing the conclusion. Okay? So we're given a conclusion. The original conclusion here is, look, Monesius, accustom yourself to believing that death is nothing to us. Now, Epicurus isn't a guru or a poet, etc. He's a philosopher, and his purpose here isn't just to make assertions or command Monesius to do one thing or another. Instead, it's to try and provide rational argument, to sort of convert him to this view through rational argument. So he's not using force of personality, he's not using some mysticism or poetic insight here. He's saying, look, Monesius, here are the reasons why you should accustom yourself to believing that death is nothing. So foolish is the man who says he fears death, Epicurus writes. And then what he does is, in his own way here, gives us reasons for accepting this thesis. Okay, so we saw that the key words that we're looking at this therefore word, and then the because. So therefore appears a couple of times. He's repeating his main conclusion below in the second therefore at this point, where he writes, therefore death is the most awful of evils and nothing to us. Therefore foolish is the man who says he fears death. etc. So, the because words, as we indicated earlier, mark reasons for believing this. And then we'll also see that he uses the logical terms, and we'll explore these in great detail further on, and either, etc. Okay, so for conclusion markers, we've got therefore. For giving reasons, we've got because, and for the logical terms, we've got here and either, and here we've got another because word, seeing that. Now, suffice to say, this is a tough text to unpack formally, but what I'll give you on the next document that we'll look at is an unpacking of this so that we can see what the actual structure of the argument is. Okay, so let's take a look at the argument, and again, this is in when we've sort of blown it up, we've taken out the conclusion, we've eliminated the repetition, and we've just stripped it down to its essentials. So the conclusion, as we've seen, is that we shouldn't fear death. And now we want to examine, how did we get to the conclusion? What were the premises or the assumptions, and what are the moves involved? Okay, so the 5 premises of this argument are going to be probably the point where you'd want to take issue with this. So let's say you didn't accept that we shouldn't fear death. Let's say you said, well, there is something. Death is in some sense a harm to me, and I don't want harms, so I think it's rational for me to be afraid of dying. If you're going to hold that position after studying Epicurus's arguments, then either you're going to have to reject his premises or reject the inferences. So you're going to claim that the premises are false, or that his argument is an invalid argument. So remember our distinction between soundness and validity for a moment. So it might turn out that this is a logically valid argument, that formally it's correct, and yet the premises could be false. And if that's the case, then even though it might be formally correct, it might be unsound, in which case we're entitled to reject the argument. So, but it's got to be one or the other. It has to be either a fault with the argument structure, the sort of pattern of inferences, or the form of the argument, or it has to be a problem with the premises. We have no other option. So, if you're going to reject Epicurus's arguments, it has to be either one or the other, either the form or accepting the truth of the premises. So when we look at this, we'll see that, what I've done here on this screen is I've separated out the moves, the inferences from the premises. So let's examine them. So when we're dead, we no longer exist, and that's a sort of a definition of death in some sense. It might be a contentious definition of death. So for example, we might say, well, it's not clear exactly what he means by death here. If he means non-existence, that sort of a death is this condition. It's a condition, of course, that no one occupies on his account. Then, okay, that's one thing. If he means the actual process of dying, that might mean something else, etc. The next one, only existing things can be harmed. We might reject that also. So, for example, it might be in some sense a harm to you that bad things happen to your offspring after you're dead. So you will in some sense have had a less valuable life if you had a great time, your life was fun, you seemed to be achieving things, and yet many of the actions that you took, it turned out, were such that the people left behind had a much significantly diminished life. If that's the case, then presumably the value of your life would be certainly reduced, or how we might evaluate it would be reduced. Of course, that's contentious. Maybe it is the case that only existing things can be harmed, and that what matters happens after your death has absolutely no bearing to the value of your life. We can't be harmed by something that hasn't happened yet. That does seem to be a contentious point. So, can we be harmed by things that haven't happened yet? Well, you think about that one. I mean, obviously, you know, well, I won't say anything about that. I'll leave that to discussion. We're either alive or dead. Well, that seems reasonably straightforward, although perhaps there are these sorts of liminal states or intermediate states, etc., that we could talk more about. It certainly seems like it takes a while for the cells in the brain to die. It could be, depending on how well refrigerated you are, up to an hour or so, or etc. So this we'd argue with the fourth premise by saying, well, I mean, maybe there is this sort of intermediate state. Finally, we shouldn't fear harmless things, and you can find ways to think about what might be wrong with that premise too. Anyhow, so I'm not saying here that these premises are decisively false, but they are, I mean, at the very least, they're intuitively reasonable. A reasonable case can be made for them. But if you are going to object to the overall argument, one way of doing so might be to engage with these premises. And if it turns out that the premises are crucial to the overall argument, and if you can find a way to show that these premises should be rejected, then the argument as a whole should be rejected. Let's look at the inference structure then, and this is an example of, and this is, I think, how he does it in the letter. So the first inference comes from the first and second premises. So it builds on the first and second premises. He says, we're not harmed by death because we don't exist. So when we're dead, we no longer exist, and only existing things can be harmed. From these two, we can conclude that we aren't harmed by death when we're dead because we don't exist. Fair enough. Let's look at the next inference. We're not harmed by death when we're alive because we're not dead yet. And this is an inference from the first premise and the third premise. So the first, when we're dead we no longer exist. The third, we can't be harmed by something that hasn't happened yet. So he can take those two and conclude we're not harmed by death when we're alive because we're not dead yet. Fair enough. So we're either alive or we're dead. This would be the fourth premise, introducing the fourth premise. And we're not harmed by death when we're alive, and we aren't harmed by death when we're dead. And we showed that in the first two inferences. So we got to that point with the first two inferences. Therefore, we're never harmed by death. And this inference then works by showing, well, we're either alive or dead, and we're not harmed by death when we're alive, and we're not harmed by death when we're dead. Therefore, we're never harmed by death because we're either alive or we're dead. In both cases, he argues, we're not harmed by death, therefore we're never harmed by death. And finally then, if you think that we're never harmed by death, we shouldn't fear harmless things, he argues. And since death is harmless, we're never harmed by death, we shouldn't fear death. So that then leads him to conclude that we should not fear death. So, once again, the purpose of the argument is to convince his friend that death is nothing to fear. He wants to convince him by rational means. He gives an argument. The argument has these roughly four inferences. It has 5 premises. And if his friend or if you disagree that we shouldn't fear death, then you either have to find fault with the form of the argument, namely the inference structure, or the premises in the argument. Okay, so that was an example of how we'd analyze an argument. And at this stage, all we're really doing is dividing the argument up into premises, inferences, and conclusions. So we're finding the parts of this argument, laying them out so that we can evaluate them. And we're recognizing that the way we can evaluate the argument is either by checking on its soundness and checking, well, or checking on its validity. The validity has to do with the form of the argument. Soundness has to do with the truth of the premises. So, a sound argument, as we've seen, is not only valid, but also has true premises. In order to evaluate the argument, then, we have to check the premises and check the pattern of inferences. If the pattern of inferences looks valid, looks good, and we'll learn more about how to do that later, then the only place to really quarrel with the argument would be with respect to the truth of the premises. In this case, then, that's what we've got. We've got the letter. We tried to find the premises. We tried to unpack what those were, what the inferences are, and it's handy here because, of course, this is a classic argument in the history of philosophy. Many philosophers really love this argument, in part because it is a relatively clear argument and it's easy to find the inferences and the premises. As we'll see in future exercises, it's sometimes not so clear what the premises are, where the inferences are, etc. Okay, till next time.